Hey, do you remember the bad guy from the last video who tried to screw over Disney? Well, here's what he's been up to. Winkler Pictures became Charles Mintz's studio in 1931. In 1933, it then became Screen Gems based on Columbia Pictures' slogan, Gems of the Screen. Mintz still had control of Crazy Cat, and he continued to pump those animations out throughout all of the 30s. That said, Crazy Cat began to see diminishing returns, especially from where it was at in the 20s. In 1930, Mintz produced a series called Toby the Pup, which did so poorly that their distributor, RKO Pictures, ended up canceling their contract and moving over to Van Buren Studios. Mintz went on to create a cartoon that revolved around a boy named Scrappy, created by Dick Huemer in 1931. At that point, Scrappy overtook Crazy Cat as Mintz's most popular property. The entire series had a wide variety of characters, and all of those characters had very clearly defined personalities. In 1933, however, Charles Mintz and Dick Huemer had a falling out. Charles tried to cut the animator's pay, and Dick protested. Dick ended up leaving Screen Gems for Disney, and some sources say that Mintz actually fired him without cause. Mintz continued production on the Scrappy series without Dick Huemer, but his real goal was to emulate Disney's Silly Symphonies.
Shut!
As with all the other 2 strips of the time, compared to the Silly Symphonies 3 strip, it wasn't even close. It was just duller. It didn't have that same... By 1939, Mintz was deeply in debt to the distributor, Columbia Pictures. The Color Rhapsodies just cost way too much and didn't make anywhere near what they were supposed to. As such, Mintz sold the entire production company directly to Columbia in 1939. Mintz was still the manager, but it was a title in name only. He was no longer calling the shots. This wasn't his rodeo. Columbia Pictures was in charge of everything now, and Mintz was just there. Charles Mintz ends up passing away the following year in 1940. In 1928, Walter Lantz replaces Charles Mintz as the lead producer at Universal Studios. Lantz took control of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which Charles Mintz took from Disney back in 1927. In 1934, Lantz would start experimenting with color, starting with a short called Jolly Little Elves. Now, he did all this under a subsect of Universal, which meant that his production company was only allowed to make cartoons that were distributed by Universal. Because of this, in 1935, he breaks away from Universal and makes his own production company, one where he is allowed to choose whatever distributor he wants, effectively breaking away from their control while also still retaining all of their previous contracts. Now, Universal would distribute whatever he created at his own studio, but he also had the option to walk away if he wanted to. Now, making his own studio is his big contribution to this video, but he is going to come back in a later episode, probably 2 out, but I plan on taking a hiatus after episode 5. So it'll be a while. We're planting a seed. We're going to let it simmer. And then we're going to come back in the spring and we're going to have a story to tell here. In my second video, I casually mentioned the name Lee DeForest and said that he had some fancy schmancy sound on film technology. Well, in 1906, he developed a device known as the Audion tube, which was able to take electricity and amplify it. It was originally developed for radio to help with long-distance calls, but in 1919, he heard about tri-ergon and realized that the same could be applied to film. In 1922, he started his own company to show off his new phonophone device. He used this company to produce a series of shorts that were all set in New York City. By 1924, DeForest had at least 34 theaters that were all wired to play sound through his phonophone device. I can't find a specific source that says that these are specifically those Red Seal theaters that he invested in with Fleischer in the last video, but he was a co-founder, and they did make theaters, so it would make sense. Do with that what you will. Over 1,000 films were shot on sound over the next 4 years. Musical performances, vaudeville routines, presidential speeches, and stand-up comedians.
Yes, her poor father, he died of throat trouble. They hung him.
Now, you'd think this is where sound on film takes off, but DeForest approached both Universal and Paramount, and both told him to shove it. They had a good system in place, and they were both making bank off of those silent movies. Adding sound would cause a whole bunch of new distribution and production problems, and they just didn't want to deal with them. It was easier to bury their head in the sand and ignore the fact that this technology existed. Adding sound would change the entire landscape of an industry that had just finally settled into a comfort zone. Careers would be upended, studios would be closed, there'd definitely be a few that would strike it big, but nobody was ready to open that Pandora's box yet. In 1929, Warner Brothers decides that they're going to throw their own hat into the ring with their own line of cartoons. They had just purchased Brunswick Records for $28 million, and they wanted to promote their new sale. They hired a man named Leon Schlesinger to produce cartoons that would sync to the records that they wanted to sell. Schlesinger went on to hire Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising to animate these new cartoons. Much like the Silly Symphonies,
Shut!
the Merry Melodies were supposed to sync to music, specifically the records that were being produced over at Brunswick. The Looney Tunes was their way of expanding the roster of characters that they could draw from. Their answer to Mickey Mouse was Bosco, the tall ink kid. Bosco is the very first Looney Tune. He was alone because there was no other Looney Tunes at the time, but he was the face for a while. He came out in an animated short in 1930 called Sinking in the Bathtub. Technically speaking, Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies are two separate series, but because of how intertangled they were, they're essentially inseparable. By 1933, Isling and Harman had a falling out with Schlesinger over financial issues. This led to them leaving Warner Brothers altogether and taking Bosco the Tall Ink Kid with them over to MGM. This left Warner Brothers and the Looney Tunes with one single cartoon, Buddy, a clone of Bosco, created by Tom Palmer. New animators were promoted to take on the headlining work while Tom Palmer became the head of the newly formed Leon Schlesinger Studios. As I mentioned earlier, Harman and Ising move over to MGM. MGM then drops iWorks as the head of their studio and promotes Harman and Ising to that position. They began to produce their own line of Bosco cartoons alongside something they were calling the Happy Harmonies in an effort to emulate Disney's business model, Mickey and Silly Symphonies.
Shut!
Unfortunately for Harman and Ising, Bosco the Tall Ink Kid and the Happy Harmonies were both discontinued in 1937, with the heads of the company being replaced by a man named Fred Quimby. God, it's getting hot. Toasty. As for Warner Brothers in 1934, Tom Palmer made the push to have all the future Merry Melodies produced in color. This was going to be difficult, considering that the tri-color technique from Technicolor was still owned by Disney exclusively, so any of the animations that they made were going to be duller, which is a common theme that we're running into this episode. As the new staff began work on a new roster of characters, Tom Palmer took over for the sole character that they had, Buddy. At all the staff meetings where they were coming up with funny things for Buddy to do, Tom Palmer always gave very vague instructions. He would always say something along the lines of, oh, add a piece of funny business, or do a visual gag, without clear indication of what that funny business or visual gag should be. According to Bernard B. Brown and Bob Clampett, Palmer's original vision was completely devoid of jokes. Fritz Freeling, Bob Clampett, and Tex Avery, hallowed be thy name, became the lead animators of the studio. Warner Brothers set them up in this lavish office with state-of-the-art air conditioning and big comfy chairs so that comfort was the least of their concerns. Wait, that doesn't seem right. Oh yeah, that's more like it. They worked in a bungalow that the animators called Termite Terrace. In 1935, Disney's exclusive rights to Technicolor lapsed. The same year, Schlesinger fired Tom Palmer and had Buddy the character retired from the Looney Tunes roster. Fritz Freeling was called in to finish any of the work that Palmer had in production when he was fired, and then he eventually became the head of Leon Schlesinger's studio. Freeling would then introduce the world to Porky Pig and Beans the Cat in the animation I Haven't Got a Hat. The short also tested the markets for characters like Oliver Owl and the twin dogs Ham and X, but Porky and Beans were the two that really stood out from the initial testing. Tex Avery became the animation director for Porky Pig, who quickly replaced Buddy as the star of the studio. Bob Clampett would go on to redesign the character to be skinnier with more childlike proportions. Now, Tex Avery was a little different than the other animators at that time. While everyone else was trying to play catch-up with Disney, Avery was trying to invent his own style. He ended up with a new zany type of animation that really set Warner Brothers aside from all the other studios in the 30s. In 1937, Tex Avery directed Porky's Duck Hunt, which is a perfect example of how his animation differed from Disney's. Whereas Disney's may have been more technically sound, his were faster, punchier, and fun. During this production, Bob Clampett changed the exit of the duck character. Instead of having him just walk off screen like he was supposed to, he had him bounce up and down on his head before hollering off into the sunset. This spawned the birth of Daffy Duck. Warner Brothers was thriving in the 30s. They were one of the few companies that were actually holding their own with Disney, And they don't even have half the roster they are going to have. Vitaphone sound-on-disc technology was invented by West Electric and Bell Telephone, harkening back to the old Tommy Lightbulb way of doing things. They would record their information on a disc and then sell their disc alongside the film. And then they would just play the film and the disc at the exact same time, and theoretically everything should be synced. In 1925, they tried to sell their technology to Hollywood the same way DeForest did in the last Tech Talk. But this time, Warner Brothers decided to take the gamble. With a nice little loan from Goldman Sachs, Warner Brothers purchased the rights to Vitaphone for $800,000. Their plan was to then lease it out to smaller production companies who would then have to pay them a premium to use it. The initial intended use was to record the orchestras, not the dialogue. Nobody even considered writing dialogue at this time. It was totally unheard of. Back in those days, dialogue was dealt with through the cutaways. Their goal wasn't to add dialogue, it was to get rid of having to pay the live orchestra that played in front of the silent movies. On August 6th of 1926, Warner Brothers releases the film Don Juan. It's the first feature-length film to be recorded on Vitaphone, and it features a massive score by the New York Philharmonic. The launch took place in the refrigerated Warner Theater on Broadway. Hi, it was called refrigerated because at that time, air conditioning was new, and nobody knew what that was. The entire event cost $3 million, and some critics even said that it was the 8th wonder of the world. Which, honestly, considering that they've never seen sound on film or air conditioning before, I understand why. Despite the success of Don Juan, movie moguls dug their heels in and did not budge on sound on film. They knew that implementing sound on film on an industrial level was going to ruin some companies. Studios would need new buildings just for their audio departments alone. Recording devices were not cheap. You'd have to buy all new ones, and all of them were state-of-the-art. You would need to wire every single theater in the country to play the music. I mean, you can't plug into speakers if the speakers aren't there. All of the sound would have to be standardized. Actors, any actor who got their training in the silent era, they just have to throw everything away and start from scratch. They learned to pantomime. They learned to project their silhouette to the back of the audience, but now they have to talk. They weren't trained for that. And that's just domestically. Foreign films, forget about them, because back before audio, you'd be able to just swap the cutaways with the translated version, but you can't do that. They're not going to be able to. Dubbing over a movie isn't invented yet. They've barely invented audio, period. So any films that were produced in sound would not sell in a foreign market at all. On top of that, there was a big pushback from musicians in particular, most of whom were worried that sound on film would put them out of a job, and honestly, rightfully so. It happened. All of those live orchestras that were playing at movies, they don't need them anymore once sound comes out. So Hollywood bigwigs just plugged their ears and hoped that all of this sound technology stuff was just a passing novelty that would wear off after a year or two. They just wanted to continue production on their silent movies, which they had become very comfortable making. That all ended in 1927 when Warner Brothers releases The Jazz Singer. Now, all of the dialogue in it was ad-libbed, and the dialogue that wasn't ad-libbed slipped back into the silent era with those cutaways, but as soon as it happened, audiences just said, why not just make the entire movie with the ad-libbed dialogue? Record it. You have sound on film now. And honestly, the industry moguls just couldn't ignore it anymore. The Jazz Singer was just too big of a success. Now, silent movies were still around, but they started slowly dying off. In 1928, Warner Brothers released Lights of New York, which was the first film to be shot with full dialogue and audio. And a year later, by 1929, 3/4 of the movies in production were being shot with some sort of sound. Between the years 1927 and 1929, the industry was begrudgingly dragged into the sound era. Every single concern the moguls had who turned down DeForest back in 24 came true. The total cost of this transformation was $300 million. By contrast, the total estimated cost of the entire industry was $75 million. That said, there's kind of this amazing silver lining here, in that Hollywood survives, actually it thrives through the Great Depression because of this sound. And it's also arguable that if this didn't go through, we wouldn't have sound on film until after World War II. I mean, we were only able to make this push because it was the end of the Roaring '20s. It was still prosperous times. And after this push, the Depression hit. Nobody's making a $300 million investment during the height of the Depression. So it's kind of a crazy journey how we got from Thomas Edison and Edward Muybridge back in 1889 all the way to here. The industry wound and wound and wound, and in 2 years, it made one hell of a loud snap.